Okay, welcome back. We are now going to get started with the second half of our class, the second half of our lecture, and we're just going to continue covering and looking at Daniel chapter 1. If you recall, we've already seen the captivity of Daniel there in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And now notice with me, the second thing we want to see and learn from our text is what I have titled the selection of Daniel, the selection of Daniel. And we see that in verses 1 through 3. Notice with me in verse 3 that we're told that along with the articles of the house of God, notice that Nebuchadnezzar also instructed the master of his eunuchs to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles. And really from the description that we get in verse 4, the idea here is the cream of the crop, the best young men that Judah had to offer. Nebuchadnezzar instructed his servant, his master of the eunuchs, to also take them into captivity. Now these young men would have been trained and they would have been indoctrinated with the language and with the literature of the Babylonians, really with the purpose of serving the king and serving in his palace. And so that's really the idea there. These young men would have been taken to Babylon. They would have been trained. They would have been indoctrinated. They would have been prepared really for the purpose of serving Nebuchadnezzar in his palace. And most likely the idea is to eventually serve the king in what we would call the administration of Jewish affairs. And so most likely Nebuchadnezzar would want to use these young men from Judah to connect with the Jewish people and possibly to try to win them over to be his supporters, to support his kingdom, to support his reign, using these Jewish captives, these Jewish young men, to win over the other Jewish people who also would be led into captivity. And this was actually a very common practice by ancient kings. They would conquer a land, they would conquer a people, and then from that people they would select a group, they would select young men, and they would train, they would indoctrinate, and they would try to use these young men to smooth the relationships with the people group that they just conquered. And so the cream of the crop was taken to Babylon, and there they were trained, they were educated, and also we're told that they were appointed a daily provision of the king's delicacies for 3 years. And really all with the purpose of being prepared, being equipped to serve the king and also to serve his administration. And notice with me in verse 6, we're told that among those of the sons of Judah, there were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now we're introduced to what we would call the main characters of the book, especially Daniel. Now as we read these names in verse 6, the first thing that should stand out about these 4 young men are their names. Their names. They have what we call theophoric names. Now what does that mean? That simply means that they have a name that connects them and that associates them with their God. Their name, there's a message behind their name, and really that message connects them, associates them with in this case, the God of Israel, with Yahweh, the true and living God. And so the first thing that stands out about these young men is their name. Their name teaches us that they are followers of God, that they come from a godly background, from a godly home, that they are servants of Yahweh, the true and living God. And let me share with you quickly what I mean. As we have said in the past, Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious. Mishael means who is what God is, or who is like God. And Azariah means Jehovah, Yahweh is my help, or Yahweh has helped me. And so we see that their names are godly names. And immediately it teaches us about their background, about their upbringing. It teaches us that most likely they were raised by godly parents. They were raised by parents who loved God, who served God, who depended upon God, who experienced the grace of God. And so we see that these four young men came from godly homes and godly parents. Most likely they were impacted by King Josiah. Most likely their parents were impacted by this great king that brought revival, that brought reformation to the land of Judah. And they were committed and they were devoted to raising their children in the faith, to raising their children under God's law in the way of Jehovah. And so that's the first thing that pops out of the text is we have these four young men and they have come from a godly home. There has been godly parents behind them who have invested in them, who have poured into them, who have shown them and who have instructed them in the ways of the Lord. And just on a side note, let me just say this. I cannot emphasize enough the impact of godly, God-fearing, Christ-loving, gospel-centered Christian parents. The impact they can have on their children. Personally, I have been impacted by the faith of my parents. I am, by the grace of God, a fourth generation Christian. It all started with a great grandfather on my mom's side by the name of Abraham. And then after that great grandfather, I have my grandparents on both sides who were believers, and also my parents were believers. My mom passed away when I was 25, and so she's already with the Lord, but my father still is a believer. He's in full-time pastoral ministry, and my parents have had such a great impact on my faith, on my life, on my ministry, on my relationship with the Lord. And I always say that other than the Lord, I am what I am, and I'm doing what I'm doing, and I believe what I believe because of the impact my parents had on my life. And so I can connect, I can really understand and connect with these four young men and the impact that most likely their parents had on their lives. And as we're going to see, they're going to take a stand in Babylon. In a moment, we're going to read about how they purposed in their heart not to defile the Lord. And I always say and I always believe the reason they were able to take that stand in Babylon is because years before, their parents took a stand in their home. That their parents first purposed in their heart that they were going to raise their children in the faith, that they were going to be light, that they were going to be examples, and that they were going to show their children the way of the Lord. And so the parents first took a stand in the home, and now in Babylon, these four young men, as we're going to see, they're going to take their stand for the Lord. But it all began in the home. Discipleship always begins first in the home. And so we see these four young men are singled out in the text. And immediately the first thing we see is their godly names, that they come from a godly pedigree, from parents who loved Yahweh, who served the Lord, and who instructed them in the ways of the Lord. But notice in verse 7 that when they arrive to Babylon, notice that we are told the first thing the Babylonians did was change their names. Change their names. And notice that we're told that to Daniel was given the name Belshazzar, and to Hananiah was given the name Shadrach, to Mishael was given the name Meshach, and to Azariah was given the name Abednego. Now scholars differ on what exactly these names mean. There's different opinions on the exact translation, the exact interpretation of these names, but most definitely all agree that they were pagan names which had a connection to the Babylonians, to the Babylonian gods, and in some way most likely honored the gods of Babylon. You'll read in the commentary that Wolvert actually gives his opinion on the translation of these names, on what they exactly mean. But most scholars would probably say that the meaning is not as clear. It seems in the text, in the manuscripts, that these names were purposefully maybe corrupted, purposefully written wrong, probably as a way to dishonor and disrespect the false gods of Babylon. But most definitely the idea behind the names is Babylonian names, pagan names, given to honor the gods of Babylon. Now with these names, really the Babylonians were doing two things. First, they were giving these young men a new identity. They wanted, and they were trying to give them a new identity, cultural transformation, and they wanted them to assimilate with and into the Babylonian culture and mentality and practices and whatnot. And then another thing they were doing is they were reminding them that they were now under Babylonian authority and ownership. And so the idea here is that these young men are taken to Babylon, and the first thing Babylon wants to do is it wants to change them. It wants to change them. Really, I always like to see it like this. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to get Jerusalem out of them, and he wanted to put Babylon in them. And so he changes their name. And by changing their name, he's trying to say, this is now your nation. I am now your king, and you are now under our gods. He wanted to change them. He wanted to influence them. He wanted them to accept the culture and the practices and the customs of Babylon. And we see that. We see that in the text. That's what these young men were facing from Babylon. And I think the main thing I want you to see here is that there's pressure on these young men to compromise their faith, to compromise their beliefs, to compromise their convictions, to compromise their godly background, their godly upbringing, and ultimately to compromise their relationship with the Lord. They go to Babylon. They're young. They are educated by the Babylonians. They're wined and dined. Their names are changed. They're cut off from their people, from the temple, and all with the goal of wanting them to compromise, wanting them to assimilate and to mix in with Babylon. Compromise. That's always one of the big temptations that the enemy throws at us, that this world system throws at us. Satan always wants us to compromise. The world system always wants us to compromise our faith, compromise our convictions, compromise our trust in the Word of God, and ultimately compromise our relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. Everything around us, this world system and the enemy of our soul is working against us to try to get us to compromise. And that happened to Daniel, it happened to his friends, and it still happens to us today. But notice now, third, in verses 8 through 16, that in the midst of everything, in the midst of the pressure, in the midst of the temptation, in the midst of the attacks, notice now the decision of Daniel. The decision of Daniel and his friends. Because notice in verse 8 that in the midst of the Babylonians changing their name and educating them and training them and offering them the food, the wine from the king's table, notice that in the midst of it all, we read the words, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Daniel, in the midst of everything, in the midst of the temptation, of the attraction and lure of Babylon, Daniel made a decision. Daniel took a stand, and Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with all of the king's delicacies. You know, when I read that, I think again about those words that Philip Bliss wrote for his Sunday school class. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. Daniel made a decision. Now in verse 8, the key word that I want you to see with me is the word defile. The word defile. Daniel understood, Daniel had the conviction that by partaking of the food and partaking of the wine that was offered to him, he would be defiling himself before the Lord. Now the question amongst the students of the Bible, amongst, I guess you would say, Bible scholars, is how would this food be bringing defilement before the Lord? How would partaking of the king's delicacies bring defilement? What exactly is going on here? And there has been different suggestions behind that. Some have suggested that the Babylonian food probably broke the dietary laws of the Mosaic covenant. It probably wasn't prepared the way that the law commanded the food to be prepared. And so that's why Daniel refused to partake of it. Probably also the meat was not in accordance with the Mosaic covenant. Some have also suggested that the Babylonian food, before it was served, was dedicated to the false gods of Babylon. And so before the food, before the wine was given, it would have first gone to the temple of the Babylonians, to the temples of Nebuchadnezzar, and it would have been offered to the false gods, offered as an offering, as a sacrifice, and then it would have been given to the Jewish captives, these young men. And so many would say that's why Daniel refused to partake of it. And then others have suggested that probably what was taking place here was not so much external, but internal. It was probably a little more deep than that. And probably what was going on here was a matter of trust, was a matter of dependence. Who is Daniel trusting for his sustenance? Where does Daniel's loyalty lie? By partaking of this food, Daniel, in his mind, perhaps was thinking that he would be trusting in the king of Babylon for his sustenance rather than in God. Eating vegetables, going on his diet was a way that he was showing his trust in God from the beginning. And so some would say that there's probably even a theological meaning behind this. Now the question is, which one is correct? I believe all of them. I believe all of them. I believe that this food was not in accordance with the Mosaic law, the dietary laws, that most definitely this food would have been offered to the false gods of Babylon before served, and most definitely that by keeping himself from this food, from the table of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel was showing, Daniel was confirming from the beginning his trust in Jehovah, that his sustenance ultimately, even in captivity, would come from the table of Jehovah and not from Nebuchadnezzar. I believe all of them are true and are the case. And Daniel had the conviction that by partaking of the king's delicacy, he would be defiling his heart before the Lord. And so Daniel purposed in his heart to not defile himself. And in the idea there, he took a stand in the midst of a fallen world. And notice in verse 9 that we're told that God gave Daniel favor in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. That as Daniel is taking his stand, as Daniel is purposing in his heart not to defile himself before the Lord, God is with him. God is with him. God is honoring his decision. God is giving him the grace to make that decision. Ultimately, it's not Daniel making it, but it's the grace of God in Daniel. And God gave Daniel favor in the sight of Nebuchadnezzar's servant. Once again, with that word gave or brought, we are reminded who's in control. We're reminded that ultimately God is sovereign and God is in control, and God is fulfilling his plans and purposes. And so notice in verse 12, Daniel requested that he and his friends be served only vegetables to eat and water to drink. Many would say as a way to show their dependency, their trust in the Lord. And then after 10 days, the chief eunuch would examine Daniel and his friends, and they would the chief eunuch would then see their condition, their appearance, compared to those who ate from the table of the king. And the chief eunuch agreed, and sure enough, notice verse 15, after 10 days, we're told that their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. And so the idea there is Daniel and his friends honored God, and in return, God honored them. God honored them. And let's finish up our text. And notice the final thing we see is the exaltation of Daniel, the exaltation. Notice verses 17 through 21. We now see that God honors and blesses Daniel and his companion. Because in verse 17 we're told once again that God gave the four young men. But notice now, knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Once again, in verse 17, we read the words, God gave. God gave. And so it's almost like over and over from the beginning, Daniel is pointing us to the sovereignty of God. He wants us to understand that ultimately God is in control here. Ultimately, God is sovereign here. Ultimately, God is fulfilling his plans and his purposes, and God is active. God has not distanced himself. God has not gone to the sidelines, but God is active. God is involved. And even in Babylon, God is God. God is sovereign. And God is in control. And that theme, Daniel is going to just continue to beat and present it to us, the sovereignty of Jehovah. That whether it's in Jerusalem, whether it's in Judah or in Babylon, wherever it is, God is Lord over all creation. And God honors his servants. God blesses these four young men, and God rewards their faithfulness. God honors those who honor him. Listen, honor God, and God will honor you. God will never put to shame those who trust in him. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. That doesn't mean you're not going to suffer. That doesn't mean you're going to be rich and prosperous in this lifetime. Don't misunderstand me. But it does mean that all things work for the good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purposes. It does mean that no matter what happens, God is with you, and God is going to work it out some way, somehow, for the good to fulfill his purposes and plans. And so God gave these young men knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and God also gives Daniel understanding. Notice verse 17, in all visions and dreams. And really, that statement is preparing us already for chapter 2 and already for chapter 7 and 8 and 9, that God endows Daniel with the gift of interpretation, with the gift and understanding of visions and dreams. And notice in verse 18, I'm going to end with this. When the time had come for the young man to be presented before Nebuchadnezzar, 3 years later, and so at this point they're probably approximately 18 to 20 years old, we're actually told in verse 20 that in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. And the idea there is there was nobody compared to Daniel and his three friends. Because ultimately there's no one compared to God, to the God of Israel, to Jehovah, Yahweh. And Daniel and his three friends honored God, and in return God honored them, and God exalted them before the Babylonians. Because God honors those who honor him. And so that is chapter 1 of the book of Daniel. God bless you. Grace and peace. If you have any questions or any comments, make sure to email me. Make sure to reach out to me for next week. If there is a question, I can begin class discussing the question, commenting on the question, answering any question that there would be from the text today. But God bless you, fam. Grace and peace. Have an awesome weekend. Have an awesome week in the Lord. And the exhortation is dare to be a Daniel. This weekend, this week, dare to be a Daniel. Honor God. Take a stand for God and trust and know that God will honor you. God will bless you because God honors those who honor him. And all those who put their trust in him will by no means be put to shame. Dare to be a Daniel. God bless you, fam. Grace and peace. We are dismissed. I will see you guys soon. Bye.